Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me and you can see me. Can you hear and can you see me? I'm not sure if you can hear me and if you can see me. Hope everyone is doing well. Can I just get a quick confirmation that I can be heard and you can see me? It seems there is, again, something is not right here. Yes, thank you, Phil. Sound and vision is good. Thank you. So, what I'm gonna do is now, yes, I can hear the sounds now. It seems we are working. I am gonna join, I'm gonna go to Canada and we will have Dan Gibson with us. And we will be questioning Dan Gibson regarding the research he did. I am guessing some of you read this book called Early Islamic Qiblas. So we will be talking about this book. We will be talking about a couple of the mosques are been mentioned in this book, and we will be keeping Islam accountable. So let me just give me a minute. I'll just call Dan Gibson and then we take it from there. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Peace of Christ be with you, Dan. How are you?
I am fine, and you?
By God's grace, I am good. Thank you. Can I just get quick check from audience from YouTube if you can hear and if you can see Dan Gibson? So we are live, Dan Gibson.
Okay.
Can I just get a quick permission from you that you are okay to be recorded on this live stream?
Yes, it's perfectly fine. I'm expecting it.
Good. You never know what happens with YouTube.
Right.
How are you, sir?
I am good.
What have you been doing these days?
Oh, I'm studying. I'm still doing more research. The research never ends. And making YouTube videos. I have my own channel, so if people want to go there, they can see some of the YouTube videos there as well.
Okay. So, please fill me in. I'll just introduce you a little bit. I come across with your book on Quranic Geography a couple of years ago, which I thought it was amazingly helpful to us also, some Muslims who think generally. Also, last year, or maybe it's been 2 years now, I come across your book on early Islamic Qiblas.
Right.
So beside doing research and writing, what do you do?
Mostly I research and write. That's what I spend all my time doing. Sometimes up to 60 hours a week. So I don't have much other life than that.
Okay. So you are based in Canada?
I am based in Canada now. We were in the Middle East for many years, and then I lived near Vancouver for a number of years, and now I'm out in the middle of the prairies in Canada, so far away from any big cities.
Okay. Is that because it is easier to do writings?
No, it is. I can concentrate, and also family is around, so I'm with family now.
Okay. Did you just have Thanksgiving or you are going to have Thanksgiving?
No, Canadians had Thanksgiving a month ago already, more than a month ago.
Okay.
That's because in Canada it's cold right now. There's snow outside, so we're in the middle of winter.
Okay. England is not as cold as it's supposed to be, but outside is beautiful with God's creation.
Yes.
So
the snow is beautiful too.
Oh, well, God's creation is beautiful. Our God
It
is
is.
amazing.
That's right.
So, what I thought, if that's okay with you, we look at tonight is mainly talk about your book on early Islamic Qiblas, and then try to understand what it is all about. So those of you who are joining us on YouTube, remember our topic is early Islamic Qiblas. So please keep your conversations around the topic so that everyone can participate well. And if you have any question, please write "add" in front of DCCI Ministries. It will get my attention and we can ask that to our guest. And please keep your comments in English and kind and nice. Freedom of speech is encouraged, but please do not abuse the freedom of speech. Dan Gibson, before you put this book together, early Islamic Qiblas, you put together Quranic Geography. Can I
Yes.
just have little bit background of it? Where did it all come from? Why would you do that?
We have to back up a little bit farther behind that. I was in the Middle East. I've spent many, many years in the Middle East, but at this point, I had a contract with the Jordanian government to produce some materials. The project was to take what the archaeologists were writing and to produce materials that common everyday people could understand, that could be sold to tourists and to other people who were interested in what was going on. So I had to go through all the archaeological reports and all the materials and produce things for common people. And that was the first book, called The Nabataeans. And so while I was studying that, I became aware of some difficulties with history. I have been studying and was very familiar with the history of biblical history, as well as the history of the Arabian Peninsula. And I was aware, of this history of the biblical stuff and the Greeks and the Romans and of the Nabataeans. Writing a book on the Nabataeans, making the website and doing all the research, I realized that the history that I was looking at of Arabia was very different from what my Muslim friends were telling me, that when Muhammad came, it was just tribes out in the desert and they were all fighting with each other. And I couldn't put the two histories together. So I have the history coming from the known history that the West has, and then I have the other history which I knew about going back to Muhammad, and they didn't seem to match.
Yeah.
And I kept thinking, there's a problem here. And I would always tell my friends, someday somebody's got to look into this and match up the early Islamic history with the history we know of the Middle East and of the Nabataean people. And I just left it at that. And several years went by, many years went by, and I kept looking at it and thinking every once in a while. And one time I was in Europe. I was teaching at a college, and I realized suddenly I had nothing to do in the afternoon. I was teaching all morning. I had not brought any work with me. So I went to the library and I found the book Sirat Rasulullah, which is the story of the Prophet Muhammad. It's the story that's been put together of Ibn Ishaq. And so I decided I would read that and I would think about the geography, because I knew the geography of the Middle East. I'd been in all the countries of the Middle East pretty well. And I'd spent years in Yemen. I'd spent time up in Jordan, was out with in Petra and out with Bedouin. And so as I read through that, I began to think through the history, and suddenly it made sense only if the city of Mecca was in the north of Arabia, because they would march out of Medina to the north. The Quraysh would attack from the north down to the south. And as I read through it, I thought, there's something to this, that the founding of Islam was in the northern part of Arabia. But I said to my wife, I cannot study this because I would need at least a year to just read everything, read the early accounts, read the later accounts, try to figure it out. And so I did not tackle it until I think it was about the year 2009 that I got a sabbatical, and I was able to take 1 year, and I said, I'm going to study this year. I'm going to try to look at both histories and see if I can fit them together somehow. And one of the first things I did is I remembered that mosques face towards Jerusalem, the first mosques. This is what all my Muslim friends told me. We always prayed to Jerusalem. And in my travels, I'd come across a number of mosques that the people at the mosque said, this mosque faces Jerusalem. But I had found quite a few mosques like that, that people had said, our mosque faces Jerusalem, and that's why the first mosque was here, and then the new mosque faces Mecca. So I decided to just make a little chart and put down these mosques that face Jerusalem. And then I decided to measure things. Back then, we started using a GPS when we were out in the desert looking at Nabataean things. We always carried a GPS. This is before a GPS was in your cell phone. And so we had to have an actual manual GPS and look at it. So if we found something in the desert, we could mark down the actual coordinates where that find was. So if we saw some writing on a rock, we would write, now this is the GPS coordinates, so somebody else could find it later. So I decided now I've got satellites, I can go to these mosques and I can just double check to make sure that they are pointing Jerusalem, because people sometimes are just talking. They just say things. So I started visiting mosques, and that's when I got the big surprise. Because as I visited mosques, I started to discover that there were mosques that did not face Mecca and Saudi Arabia, and they did not face towards Jerusalem. And so I started to make a list of these mosques and take a map and start drawing the lines. Where do these mosques point to? From the south, from the east, from the west, from the north. And I began to realize these mosques point to the very area that I was studying. That was the big shock. That I had been studying the city of Petra. I had been there with permission from the Jordanian government. I had gone 60 times in and out of the Petra area and cataloged everything. I had spoken to all the archaeologists who were digging at the time. I had made up reports. I had written a book. And suddenly, these mosques seemed to be pointing to this area. Now, I had traveled all over that area, up and down all the wadis and over all the hills. And so it was just fascinating to me. How could these mosques point to this place? So my study took two different prongs to it. One of them was these Qibla. The Qibla is the direction that a person prays towards in a mosque. So the mosque is designed so that people can pray in a particular direction. So it just means the direction that people face. And the second thing was, how do I fit that over top of Islamic history? Because nobody had ever said anything about the Qibla facing any other direction than either to Jerusalem or to Mecca and Saudi Arabia. So suddenly I started really poring over Islamic history. I had to read all the hadiths. I needed to read the histories. I needed to try to put together a picture of how did this work. So two studies. One is the Qiblas, and the second one is how do these Qiblas fit in Islamic history, and what can Islamic history tell us about Qibla directions?
Okay. Let me just help those of people who are watching through YouTube. Why, at the first place, that Muslims were turning their face towards Jerusalem than the Mecca? So, Muslims pray 5 times a day, and as they set up their prayer today in 21st century, most Muslims are turning their face towards Mecca, towards Kaaba. It is because, according to Surah 2, verse 142 to 45, I'll just read the I just read the parts which I think it's interesting. This is Surah 2, verse 142 to 145. So there was a point, time and place, Muslims are praying to different direction, then Allah steps in, and in verse 144 tells, we have certainly seen the turning of your face, O Muhammad, towards the heaven, and we will surely turn you to Qibla with which you will be pleased. So turn your face towards Masjid al-Haram. Allah is changing direction of the prayer from somewhere towards the Masjid al-Haram in the intention Allah wants to please Muhammad, so which you will be pleased. Of course, we will have lots of questions on that part. So Quran doesn't tell us at the first place it was Jerusalem. Is that correct, Dan Gibson?
That's correct. It does not tell us that, and nowhere in the Quran does it mention Jerusalem, and most of the hadiths do not mention Jerusalem as well. I've only found one or two places that will mention Jerusalem.
Yeah, so that's miracle of Islam. Miracle of Islam. So, as you kind of try to notice, actually, no, those mosques are not facing towards Jerusalem, neither they are facing towards Mecca. I'm just a bit curious, how were you able to find the place of I forgot the name.
Masjid al-Haram? No.
No,
I mean, the Quran doesn't tell Muhammad where to pray towards as well. It doesn't say where he was praying, and it doesn't give the name of the city towards which he should pray.
yes.
So when you look in your Quran, you'll only find the word Mecca used once in the Quran, and some people argue it's there twice. They may argue about the word Becca, but the Quran doesn't name names of places. I did a study when I did the book up, Quranic Geography. This is the first book that I wrote. Right at the beginning, I listed all of the places in the Quran that are listed, all of the geographical references. And I came up with the entire Quran with 9 places mentioned in the Quran. Many of them are not clear because it talks about the people of the ditch, for instance. Now, where and what? If you don't know the history, you don't know where that place is. So there are actually very, very few places in the Quran that you actually have a geographical name. And so this is the problem we have with the city of Mecca. Muslims will tell me that this is the city of Mecca because it says here the Kaaba. Well, the Kaaba is a building that has the black rock in the side, but they're assuming the Kaaba was always in Mecca, but it doesn't say Mecca. It talks about the Kaaba. It talks about the holy house. Okay, now Muslims are assuming the holy house was always in Mecca, but the Quran doesn't say Mecca. It just says the holy house. They assume that when it talks about Masjid al-Haram, this is the forbidden gathering place for bowing down. Masjid is a place of bowing down, and Haram is forbidden. So they assume when it talks about Masjid al-Haram that this is Mecca in Saudi Arabia. But the Quran doesn't say that it's Mecca in Saudi Arabia. It just talks about Masjid al-Haram. So this is the problem with geography. The Quran is not specific. And so we do not know from the Quran where they prayed before. We do not know from the Quran the city to which they prayed later because the city is not named. Therefore, the Quran is very vague on this. So when we come, the way to tell this, I believe, is then to go and look at the mosques. Visit a mosque, see where the mosque is. This is where the people lined up. You can always tell because a mosque is wider than it is deep, and there is a wall that is known as the Qibla wall because Muslims line up shoulder to shoulder in long lines facing one wall. And so that is known as the Qibla wall. That's the wall for they pray towards. So we can visit a mosque, we can go in and see where the Qibla is. And then oftentimes, now in the first 50, 60 years of Islam, they did not mark the wall in any way. It was only later that they hung a sign originally in a couple of the mosques, and then they started putting a mark on the wall, and eventually they built a concave, I don't know what would you call it, sort of a dome on the outside, a wall there so that they could pray towards that. That's called the mihrab, and that's the mark. So you go into a mosque today, there's a mihrab, we know which way to pray. But the earliest mosques did not have a mark. You simply have to find the longest wall. And this is the wall, and you can see how it's constructed. It's very easy to walk in and say, this is how it works. And the people line up in lines, usually because there's pillars. And so you can see how they can line up. And we can see which way the mosque is oriented. And so I began to check the actual buildings. Many of these buildings had been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt. So I couldn't measure because I can't see the original building. And so I might be looking at a building that's only 500 years old, or maybe one that's only 200 or 300 years old. So I had to go back and find the oldest mosques that I could measure and then place them on a map and try to find out where was Masjid al-Haram and the Kaaba and the holy city, and where was, all these things that are described here, the house, the holy house, the sacred house, and so forth. And that's when I started to get this map with the directions pointing not at Mecca in Saudi Arabia, but pointing north, and it was in the region of the city of Petra.
So let me just try to break it down a little bit. So
Okay.
in 708, that is the date for the introduction of the mihrab.
Right. Okay.
So
Now
that's
I use Quranic Geography because in the back there's a timetable, and I'm always flipping back here because this helps me know what year she's talking about, because I prefer dates in Hijrah, and she wants 708, which is 89 after the Hijrah. Okay. This is the very earliest the mihrab is invented here, and it's used in at this point for people to point their mosques towards Mecca in Saudi Arabia.
so mihrab is the sign usually on the wall that when Muslims stand for prayer, that's where they face to. Okay.
That is correct.
So today you can just turn up the Regent Park Mosque or any mosque wherever you are. It is very easy to put that together because it's on the wall. It is very visible.
Yes.
So we are talking about the mosques 1,400 years ago.
Yeah.
Can you just break it down for me once again? How were you able to find mosque which was built before 708, before the official mihrab has been introduced? How were
Okay.
you able to find the direction of the prayer?
Generally, the entire building is oriented towards the direction of prayer.
Okay.
And there is a Qibla wall. There is a wall, so there's an area where people can line up and face that Qibla direction. Very often, there is a later mihrab added to that mosque. So very often, you might find the mihrab for Mecca in the corner, but it will have a date there. We can see when that was added at a later date. And so when a mosque has two qiblas, it has one here and it has one here. These are called qiblatain mosques. The tain doubles the qibla, so it means there's two qiblas in that mosque. So there are some early mosques which are qiblatain. I found 3, 4 of them, and they are clearly marked with two qiblas on the wall. But most of the early mosques were abandoned at some time, and these are the ones I can go and check because they were built, and later they were abandoned, the building knocked down, and so forth. So now we can go back and look. Many times archaeologists have dug up the ruins, and they say, here is the mosque, and we can go and check that mosque. And usually it's just a foundation. All you're looking at is the foundation, because the rest of the building has gone because it's so old that they've reused many of the stones in something else.
Yeah. So when, as you kind of went to these places and then try to find out where is the direction of the prayer, which you did, let me just pick a mosque in Egypt, for example. We are talking around 600, 700s. They didn't have Samsung phone. They didn't have Apple computers. Therefore, wouldn't you say, actually, yeah, it's okay if they did not get the direction correct? Let's say, sake of the argument, it was always Mecca, okay,
Yeah.
and Islamic tradition is all correct. Abraham built the Kaaba, and then Muhammad comes to confirm that, all those kind of things. It has always been there, but people did not have the technology to get the right direction.
Yes, this is a argument I've faced many times, and there is something to this because one of the arguments we face is what I would call specificity. How specific can you be? For instance, if I have people measuring mosques and they'll say, "Oh, I measured it and I got zero point 0.3 degrees different than you." Okay, and I'm like 0 0.3 degrees. I mean, the
It's
difference
just
is so,
nothing.
it's nothing, but for them, oh, but you have to be accurate, and they want to be accurate too within a small degree. I don't believe the early builders were that accurate, and I don't know if you can measure a mosque with being that accurate. Oftentimes when we got to a mosque, let me just use an example. Here's a mosque building. If we decided this is the Qibla wall, sometimes we would have to run a rope all the way out here to make it even bigger so that we could measure this long distance, because it's very hard to measure something that may be only 30 or 40 feet long. So, I mean, you make it wider and then we can measure it a little more accurately. So there is the struggle with measuring the actual building. Now, a few years ago now, it's not very long ago, that satellite photos were suddenly made available to us. And by this, we've been able to, we can access satellite photos of varying degrees of accuracy. The most accurate satellite photos are held by military. And so they are able to measure things, and they talk about maybe they could read the newspaper you're holding. I don't know how good their cameras are, but the satellite imagery at the beginning was blurry, but over the years it has become better and better and better. And different countries have put up different satellites. Japan has an amazing set of satellites, images from all over the world for studying plants that are growing and where they are and so forth, and the temperature of things. But they have amazingly accurate images that we can get a hold of. So we can measure from satellite. We can also go to the mosque and actually visit it and look. And that's what I suggest for every mosque. If I possibly can get there, I will get there. If I cannot get there, I make sure that ask if another researcher can get there, someone who understands what they're researching. And otherwise, I've used other people as well, and just tried to get people to go there, take pictures, take some measurements, and check them so we can make sure what we're looking at down from a satellite is what we're actually seeing on the ground.
Yeah.
Because once you get inside a building or at the spot, you might recognize, okay, actually, we're not looking at this correctly from above, and it's slightly different. For instance, down in Africa, there's a couple of mosques there, and one of them is a Qiblatain. It has two Qiblas, but the only way you can tell is to actually visit the mosque, because they're both on the same wall. One is pointing one way and one is pointing slightly the other way. You cannot see that from space. And fortunately, we were able to get there and look at that mosque, because just in the last year or two, that Qibla wall has crashed down, and you can't measure it anymore. So, I mean, you can measure it very generally, but you can't be more specific, because you can't be there to see what's there on the ground. So I've tried to measure mosques. I continue. So when you get to this book, there's a couple of things in this book that are not quite accurate. I mean, the measuring is accurate. The conclusion is not actually accurate, because I didn't see the bigger picture. So when we published this book here, this one is in 2010. This one, what year is this? I think it's 16 or 17. I'll have to check. Yes, 2017. So this is 7 years later. This book came out, and it has charts, and I thought we were pretty well finished. So we published this book thinking this is all the data, and more data comes in. More mosques have come in. As we've gone on the internet and have made some videos, and as we made a film, a documentary film, and now we've allowed people to contact us, lots more suggestions are coming in. What about this mosque? What about this mosque in my hometown? Or what? And suddenly we're looking again. So now we've got on the internet something we call the Qibla tool. And I'll ask you at some point to put up the address.
I
You
will.
can go on the internet and you can look at this tool. It lists all the mosques that we have so far. Actually, the tool is not even up to date. I have several more mosques on my computer waiting to be added to the tool. So this thing keeps growing because we're trying to find every mosque from this period of time. I remember when I first came out with this book, one man was very angry at me. He said, "You've just picked and choose." And no, I was looking for every mosque I could find. But over time, we found more mosques and more mosques. So the Qibla tool is up to date, and we have over 100 mosques there that we look at from the first 200 years of Islam, and trying to tell the story and figure out what do these mosques tell us by their different Qibla directions.
Yeah, so those of you who are watching from YouTube, first book Dan Gibson is talking about is the Quranic Geography. So first, that's the one we read, and then we move to the second one, which is called Islamic Qiblas, early Islamic Qiblas. So that's the order of the book. You will find it's helpful.
Right.
I guess my problem, not my problem actually, I guess problem Islam supposed to have or Muslims supposed to have is, or the questions they will have. And by the way, I am aware that in the different part of the world where certain group of Muslims now decided to turn their face towards Petra as they pray, and they are trying to do their Hajj towards Petra. I am aware of that. But my question would be in the lines of, for example, Ubay bin Ka'b. He's one of the Sahaba of Muhammad, or other Sahabas, as they were, like, I know Muhammad couldn't read and write, all those kind of things, but as other Sahabas, they were building the mosques. What were they using as a tool? Like, which side for the, what is the side of the Mecca? What is the side of Petra that they got this all mixed? If it is at the first place in the Mecca, what the Muslims were using in 7th century, 8th century, I'll go until 9th century.
You want to go into the explanation of how they found the Qibla direction.
Yeah, like how
Okay.
did they, like like today, like for example, I came from, I can just put my phone and then my phone tells me where to go.
Right.
But in 7th century, they didn't have those things. How did people knew where they need to put their mihrab so that they get the direction correct? How were they able to know at the first place how to do so?
We have a couple of problems here in getting this information. One is that there is very little literature from this period of time. We can't just go and look at other things that were written in Arabia at that time, because we're in a literary vacuum. We have the Quran, but we don't have any other literature alongside of it. We can't go and compare it with something else written there. So what we have to do is end up going to the hadiths and the histories, all of them written 200 or 300 years later.
Yeah.
And all trying to go back. And then we can go even farther on, and we can go to more books that were written following that. So we can go 400, 500, 600 years later. Now, 600 years later, there's lots of books that have been written at this time. So, and they have lots of opinions. And so we have to look and decide, where are we getting our information from?
So we don't have anything from 7th century and 8th century tells us how Muhammad and his followers and caliphs were able to find how they need to build their mosque towards Mecca.
That's right.
Okay.
Now, we have some clues, and they come to us from various places, and there are several methods that have been suggested. I don't know if you want to get into technical explanation, but some of them are not technical at all. For instance,
I want to keep it simple.
yes,
Main reason is because I am female host of the program, and I know Muslims believe I am deficient in mind. So what I'm gonna do is now I'm gonna show this Qibla tool on the screen. Okay.
okay.
And I also put this in the description of this video. So what I want, if that's okay with you, first I want you to tell us how we use this.
Okay, what
How
are
we
you
can
putting
use.
on the screen? Because I can't see your screen, so
Yes, just a moment. Share screen.
just or divide it up for me.
Okay. Sorry, there is something practically not happening in this site.
Okay, tell me which picture you're putting on the screen.
So I've got this website called thesecretcity.ca.
CA from Canada. That's the Sacred City. That is the name of the documentary film we made. So you
Yeah.
can go and view the film called The Sacred City. You can go into that website and you can go to look at the data, because we're trying to put up the data that we've collected. And you can go and look at this tool, the Qibla tool, and then you can look at all the mosques. It allows you to look down at mosques. You can zoom in and see them. And then it gives you on the right information about the mosque. And there's even a more info, so you can click on that. And we've tried to put up some extra information on each of these mosques. So you can look at, there's a lot of mosques listed there. So you could spend a lot of time going through this.
So I'm just trying to share my screen with you as well, because currently it's on YouTube, but you can't see it. Are you able to see my screen?
No, I cannot see
No.
your screen.
Okay.
Okay, don't worry about it. Just tell me what's on your screen.
So what is in my screen is this website with the map.
Okay.
And in this map, what I have is I can just go on site, and then it says
Now, on the right, it says by category. What category have you chosen?
I've got Petra.
Okay, so we can look at the mosques that point to Petra.
Yeah.
If you look there, we have the ones pointing to Mecca, to Petra, to between, to Jerusalem. Those that were parallel and unknown are other well-known mosques, but we cannot tell exactly where because they were rebuilt or something. But we still mention them because they are ancient mosques, but we cannot calculate them. This way, I have a list of all of the mosques from this period of time that I know of.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've pulled up Petra.
So I've got Petra, and then on the one side where it says city, you can know where this mosque is, what is the name of the mosque. Next to it, we have the date for like normal British date as well as Islamic date.
Right.
Okay. And also under it, we do have information of the coordinates as well as when you look at the direction of the mosque, for example, the one I'm looking at, it tells me
which mosque are you on?
Katmisha Church, but I can change that to something. Let me change that to
Pick Al-Aqsa is down below it.
Yes. So
okay,
this mosque is
double click on Al-Aqsa.
Oh, got it. Yeah.
Okay, now on the right in the box, you see the little red Petra, Jerusalem, Mecca. So
Yes.
those colors are the lines that are lined up over on the right. You can zoom in if you've got a mouse to scroll.
Yeah.
You can zoom in and look. So you can see the Dome of the Rock above, and you can see the Al-Aqsa Mosque underneath.
Yeah. So,
And so the Mecca line is green. You can see the Al-Aqsa Mosque is not oriented towards Mecca. It is actually oriented much more to the south.
so it is approximately 12 degree off from Mecca. That's like a
Yes.
lot of degree.
Yeah, and from Petra, it is only 3.4 degrees off
Yeah.
of Petra.
Yeah. So when you compare, it's like more towards Petra than towards Mecca. Okay.
Right.
Let me pick another one. Have you got another one
Okay,
in your
right,
mind?
right above it, you'll see where it says Jerusalem. Double click on that little red thing. That's the dome of the chain.
Yes.
That's a very small little mosque beside the Dome of the Rock. Most people don't even look at it because they don't even know it's there.
Apparently, this is 14 degrees off Mecca and 1 degree is off Petra. So it's more
Uh,
towards Petra.
Much more. On the bottom, you'll see more info. Do you see where it says more info?
Yes.
Double click that, or just click that, and then you can see some pictures of it. It is a small dome, but it actually has a mihrab. You see on the one side of it, it has direction. You can slide down on the pictures and see it gives direction
Yeah.
to the Dome of the Rock.
So okay, people can see that on YouTube as well.
Okay.
Okay, so this is how we use this website. So you
Yeah.
just pick where you want to look, and then it gives you the dates. It tells you how many degree it's off, where it is more close to. I
Right.
think this is very useful tool.
And then if you want more information, there's often photographs we've been there or other information we've collected.
Yeah. Okay. So let me try to get rid of this one, and then go back to live stream page. Okay. So now you went those mosques, most of them. I think you were not able to go to the one in Saudi Arabia.
That is correct.
So as you find the direction of the prayer, and then when you noticed actually they are missing Mecca, not only like
Yeah,
missing by a couple of degree, but like they are pointing Petra, which you had a knowledge of Petra very well. How did you feel?
I didn't believe it. When I first saw this, I couldn't believe it. It didn't seem possible. It was just, I mean, yeah, I mean, and then I thought, I need to disprove this. I mean, it should be easy to disprove. I should be able to find information. I should be able to disprove this idea, and then I can just move on because, you're not looking for this. I was simply looking for what points, what faces Jerusalem, and I didn't find a single mosque that faced Jerusalem. They all missed Jerusalem, and that's when I did the lineup. I realized because I have some mosques in Oman that were also, they said in Oman, oh yeah, we face Jerusalem, but when you look at it, they're facing to Petra, a mosque over in Cairo. Now, the mosque in Cairo, we don't have the original uh, the foundation anymore. It's all been changed, but we do have a description of it, and they tell us there that people prayed due east from this mosque. So I just took the mosque and drew a line east, and that's the direction they prayed, towards the east. And guess what's directly east of that mosque? Is Petra. So we have, we have these mosques here. You can go through and you can look at them. This is the first 70, 80 years of Islam. Everything points towards Petra. Now, if you want, how accurate could they be? you can go down there and see they're all within a 30 or 40 kilometer range. So some are less accurate than others, but I mean, when you're facing far away, to be a little bit off is expected. I would expect up to 8 degrees, they could be off, but you'd still get an idea of where that mosque is pointing and directed. And you draw the line on the map and you have a look at it, and sure enough, they are pointing to Petra. So the next question I had, because for me that settled the Petra question as far as archaeology was concerned. The next question was, what is there from Islamic history that will back up the Qibla that is facing towards Petra?
Yeah.
Because I mean, the mosques are there. You can go out, you can measure them, you can argue a few degrees, but we have a lot of mosques that are facing this direction. We have 0 mosques facing Mecca at this time.
So
Not a single mosque.
We have physical evidence, physical buildings. We can go and see they are not facing the headquarters of Islam, Mecca.
That's
But
right.
those mosques are facing to Petra.
That is
And
correct.
Islamic tradition Quran doesn't talk about Jerusalem.
No.
Quran simply says Allah wanted to please Muhammad, therefore turn your Qibla direction to Masjid al-Haram. Now,
Right. And it doesn't tell us where Masjid al-Haram is.
yes. So even though Quran is well detailed, well explained, kind of misses those basics. So when you kind of put together, yeah, it is interesting. 7th century, 1st century Hijra mosques are facing to Petra. And since you have lived there, was it easy for you to put together actually there is more than this going on?
Yes, as I began to read Islamic history and as I began to study the Quran, sometimes it would describe something and I would go, I know exactly where that place is. Okay, I've been there. And so I could go, yes. And when it talked about Abraham having been there and Hagar going there, and Hagar is in this valley, and she goes to one mountain and she looks and she can't see, and then she goes to another mountain. I can picture that exactly. I could see exactly where she stood, and she's going over there to that huge cliff over there, and she's going to that cliff over there. And then it talked, Abraham came to talk with her, and then as Abraham left, he turned around the corner out of sight. Exactly what you do in Petra as you're walking towards the Thania that goes through the rocks, this crack through the rocks. It curves to the right first and curves around. And so as she's left there, Abraham leaves her and walks away. And you could just see how this took place. So the descriptions of things just fit, and I seem to just really understand as I read it, and I could begin to say, okay, I can see how this fits, but now we have to look at some other things. As an example, there's described numerous Thanias going in and out of this city. Now, remember in the Quran, it speaks about the city, and in the Hadiths, they speak about the city of Mecca, because they are being written later, especially the Hadiths and the histories. They have forgotten the first location. So they use the words Mecca for both locations. There is an early Mecca and there is a later Mecca. And we can even find some Christian writing that talk about the city of Mecca being in Paran in Jordan.
Yeah.
Okay, and so they're talking about the first Mecca, not the second Mecca. That's what many Muslims find confusing when they're reading their Qurans and when they're reading their histories. Is this talking about the first Mecca or the second Mecca? This is a new idea for them. But archaeology clearly shows there is a first Mecca and there is a second Mecca. And
So,
then we have to decide what is this verse talking about.
just a quick question. You lived in Middle East,
Yes,
where people's mother tongue is Arabic.
that is correct.
Were you able to learn Arabic? Because I've got text, someone says your English is very good, they don't believe you speak Arabic.
Okay, I spent 3 years studying Arabic. And I am not an Arabist. I am not good at the Arabic language. I will tell people that. My wife, on the other hand, is an Arabist, and she's very, very good in the Arabic language. And so when it comes, if I need an immediate opinion on something, I ask my wife, who can explain all the grammar and how the grammar works. She has taught Arabs grammar and Arabic. She has taught people wanting to be journalists how to speak correct Arabic and so forth. So I
Question
have
is,
that, but I also have many friends who speak Arabic and who have studied Arabic, whom I can contact, and I can get multiple opinions on something. So I prefer to do my study in English, and I'll explain why. I'm sitting here behind me. I have, for instance, Al-Tabri up here in Arabic, and I have Al-Tabri in English.
yeah,
Now, I also have him on my computer in English. And in English, I can search. So I have all my Islamic books in one subdirectory. Today I was studying Abraha, this guy from Yemen who came up with the elephants to attack Mecca, which was it, the first or the second Mecca. I can go into the electronic database and type in Abraha, and it will list everything, the Encyclopedia of Islam. It will give me Ibn Sa'd, Ibn Hisham. It'll give me Al-Tabri, all of these places, so I can get them. I can look at them in English. If I have a question about how a word is used, then I can go over here and grab Ibn Hisham or Al-Tabri or somebody else and go and check that reference in Arabic to see what does it actually say in Arabic. The problem with having books like this and wanting to search is, how do you find in all of these books how many times Abraha is mentioned? There are very poor searches for the Arabic language,
yeah,
and it's very difficult because you have the middle letter and the last letter and the first letter and how it looks. In English, it's much easier to immediately search, come up with the information you want, and then check the original. That is why I do my research in English first, but I keep all the original Arabic here so I can go back then and check the text to see what does it say. I do the same if somebody asks me a question about the Bible. I
yeah,
can quickly search in English. Okay, here it is, because English has got amazing search abilities. And I can bring it up and say, here, now I can go back and check what does the Greek or what does the Hebrew say, and go back and check those texts. If I have a question, I know scholars and people who are fluent in both of those languages, have studied in them. I can go and ask them a question then, what do you think? What is your opinion? And I can get the opinion. So English is the study language, and then we reference the original language after that for specifics.
yeah.
Does that explain it?
Question is coming in the lines of,
Okay.
um, so even though you lived in Arabic-speaking countries, um, you need to know Arabic to be able to tell us where is the direction of the prayer in those mosques. That's the question is coming. But I think you guys, you are just being unnecessary silly with asking that question. I don't want to be mean. Like
Right.
I really don't want to be mean, but you
I
don't need to
think
be you don't
anyone
need to
can.
speak you don't need to speak Arabic to know where which direction your gate is turning towards. You don't need to know Arabic. And one of the good thing is Islamic sources are being translated to English. You cannot hide behind the Arabic anymore. And they are not only translated to English, they are translated to English by devoted Muslims. And I am not aware of a Muslim who told us the direction of the mosque is the number 5234 according to Arabic, but when they wrote it in English, they give us the wrong number. That's just like very, very silly argument if you are trying to make it. You don't need to know Arabic to find out what are the directions of the Qibla. Those are basics, guys. Like, just
And
think
many of them
carefully.
are very obvious. Like if you go to Anjar up in Lebanon, you go there. They not only oriented the mosque, they oriented the entire palace and the entire city towards their Qibla direction. Every building, all the streets line up, everything lined up, and so you can look at it, and everything has the same Qibla direction. So you can see it, and it's easy to check, it's easy
Yeah,
to measure because it's there. There are a couple of mosques. The one in Humaima is a good example. Um, I've been there. Many different times
that's in
because it was.
Jordan.
I'm trying to think to see where Humaima here. Qasr Humaima.
Yeah,
When
that's
it
in
comes
Jordan.
up, there are two things to measure here. The first one is the Qasr building
Uh,
itself. This is where the
ca-
Abbas family lived, and
just a moment, just a moment. Let me just put it on the screen for everyone to
okay,
see. That's the mosque in Jordan.
in
Okay.
Jordan,
Uh,
and it's Qasr Humaima.
yeah.
Can you zoom in on it?
Can I zoom
Just
on it?
Yeah,
Yes,
can
I
you
should
roll
able.
your scroll up so you've got it till it's big, till you can see two buildings that are quite distinct. The big one, and then off to the right, a smaller one. Can you see those?
So I'm zooming into the mosque.
Okay. So it's not a mosque, it's actually the building. This is the Qasr. Okay, it's a castle. It's the big house where everyone lived.
Okay.
And you can see that
Yes.
that building has a direction.
Yeah.
That building we can date because that's the original building. Okay, and it has a direction, and that entire building faces towards Petra.
Okay.
Now, over on the right, in the bottom, you see a very small little building. That is the mosque that was built later, and that we can date later. And so that mosque faces towards, more towards Petra, but it's a mosque that faces. Now, when I go to that mosque, and if you watch the documentary film, that is the mosque I'm standing in when I'm standing in this ruined mosque with the mihrab and looking at the mihrab. That mosque there, you cannot measure the back walls or the side walls. You have to measure the Qibla wall because mosques are not always square. Some of these buildings they weren't worried about. As long as you got your Qibla wall straight, the other walls don't have to be exactly. So we look at that and we can tell because there is a mihrab, there's the Qibla wall, and that is the direction of prayer. So they had to build that Qibla later on because the original place where they prayed in the center courtyard of that big building, they could just all line up and face, they knew which way the Qibla was. That was no longer good enough, so then they created another mosque outside. And so we have the early one there and we have the later one. In many places, we have this an early mosque and then we have a later mosque. In the Wasit Mosque, there's an early mosque and there's a later mosque because the early Qibla didn't point towards Mecca, so later on they had to orient their mosques towards Mecca in Saudi Arabia.
So, I just love to explain this map to the those of you who are watching. So, green color, okay, this green arrow is where like arrow kind of goes towards Mecca. Red arrow goes towards Petra. Okay, you can see the degree differences between them.
And
Approximate,
black is towards Jerusalem.
yes. So if you look at the degree differences between them, apparently it is approximate 138 degree different. When I make this map little bit bigger for us to see this side, this yellow green arrow coming to Mecca, which is somewhere like down, versus red is somewhere in the north. So person who build the mosque cannot only like, it doesn't look like they just missed with 1 or 2 degree, they missed with 138 degree. That, and then while it is close to Petra, it is not very difficult to come to the conclusion. Intention probably was to build towards Petra, and there is like 23 degree difference between Jerusalem to Petra. And so as you went to, as people in, so date of this mosque is 699. Can you just tell us a little bit what kind of methodology in that time people might be using to build this mosque in towards Petra or towards Mecca, wherever they wanted to build?
Right.
What was the like technology which we can kind of?
There were two things that are used. I've forgotten the Arabic terminology right now. But there
That's
is
fine.
one that uses the stars,
Yeah.
and then there's one that uses other things around that you can tell by.
Yeah.
So the stars are something that the Arabs used long before, and it's in there, long before other nations used it, because remember, they were merchants who traveled across the desert. The
Yeah.
desert doesn't have any roads. And so if you were a merchant in Jordan and you wanted to go to Basra in Iraq, how would you take your camels across the desert and end up in Basra? And maybe you misread it and you ended up way up north somewhere, or maybe you misread it and you end up somewhere way down in the south. So they needed to have a method to do it. And some of this method has been described to us by later writers. So I have on my shelf some of the later writers writing later who describe what the early Arabs knew, because some of it they still used. So I'll give you an example. If you're traveling north and south, they use the North Star.
Yeah.
Now, as you are farther north, the North Star gets higher. As you go south, the North Star gets lower and lower on the horizon. The North Star does not move significantly. I mean, it does move a little bit, and they had ways of talking about this movement of the North Star, but generally they measured it using your fingers held at a long distance like that. So if I hold up my fingers and I measure from the horizon up to the North Star, this is called isba, which is fingers. And then each finger was divided into 8 zams. And if you weren't sure your finger was exactly right, there were 2 stars up in the sky that you could measure between them. That was the distance of a normal finger. So eventually they would get a piece of paper and then they would slide it, I guess, this way, up and down until they could get the measurement. And so they could measure. And so you have these measurements, and we have maps that have the measurements north and south all marked out. Exactly where. So you could tell how far north or how far south you were by measuring the stars up in the sky. That just gives you an example.
Yeah.
So
Also in the book.
anybody could do that.
Yeah. Also in the book, we've got all the methods have been put together. Those of you who wants to kind of wants to look in deeper, please get the book. Also, I think you do have a couple of videos on this on your YouTube channel, so
And
people
I'm hoping to
can
do
understand
something
that.
else. I'm
Yeah.
hoping to do something more detail soon.
Sorry. I'm just gonna keep eye on the chat to see if anyone has any questions on the topic which I can ask. Please don't send me messages because it just gets me distracted. But if you have any questions, please put them on the chat. I can ask them. So when you figured out that actually there is something intentional happened, direction of the prayer was Mecca in the beginning, where because you have a physical evidence now that
It was Petra. Yeah.
those mosques are facing to Petra, and you try to discredit your argument by looking at the Islamic tradition stuff. And what made you to see that you failed to discredit your argument?
Well, everything I found supported the argument, not opposed it. And every time I looked at things, I would now once in a while somebody would suggest something. I'd go, "Oh my goodness, maybe that does disprove it," because I want something to disprove it. But then as soon as I looked at it, oh, okay, that's easily explained. An example is, what do you do with the graveyards in Mecca? Because you have a graveyard for Abdul Muttalib. You have a graveyard there's 7 early people that were supposedly buried in Mecca. Well, I heard this and I thought, oh my goodness, never, okay, that disproves everything. Then I started to look at who was buried in Mecca, and within a few minutes, I recognized one name because I know where that person died. That person died in Gaza and is buried in Gaza, and there is a grave in Gaza. So how can there also be a grave in Mecca in Saudi Arabia? And that's when I realized these are not graves in Saudi Arabia. There are no history about this. These are memorials that have been put up. And in fact, the Saudi government looked into it, decided they were memorials, and they bulldozed that graveyard because there were some Muslims who were going there praying to these people in the graves, hoping they'd get some sort of blessing from it. So they were actually praying to Abdul Muttalib or wanting to be there to get something. And so the Saudis said, we don't like this. And so they bulldozed the graveyard. But they knew that these graves were memorials that were put up. They do not go way back into history. There's something that people put up later. So, I mean, another argument I get is, what about Zamzam? Now, you brought up an interesting point when you talked about 708, the year the mihrab was developed to point in the right direction. In that year, Al-Tabari tells us that Zamzam was lost. No one knew where Zamzam was. That's a very interesting time because it's at that time that the shift is taking place between Petra and down to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And of course, the Zamzam that was up here was lost, and so they had to find and rename the well in Mecca Zamzam. But there were a number of years in between when no one knew where Zamzam was. It's a very interesting thing. Now, the word Zamzam, again, I can go to my English and I can search. And I'm not only searching all the early Islamic documents, I have on there the many Christian documents. I have the Gnostic documents. I've got lots of documents from lots of different places. So I said, I want to go look on there, Zamzam. So where do I get the word ZMZM? And I did a search for it, and I found it only in one place. ZMZM appears in the Bible in the book of Deuteronomy. And it says that there are people called Zamzimians who lived in Mount Seir. And Mount Seir is another name for the mountains where Petra was. And so these are the Zamzimians who live there. So if you're going to look for the well of the Zamzimians, where are you going to find it? You're going to find it in Mount Seir, which is Petra in Jordan. It is associated with the name ZMZM. So it just was another clue. That doesn't prove anything. It's just one more clue. If you've got a weigh scale and you're saying, well, here's this, and now I'm starting to put weights on this side, eventually the weigh scale is going to tip in this direction. And it took a while for me to be convinced. And so when I meet my Muslim friends and they first hear this, they go, oh, no, it can't be. And they get all upset. And it's like, well, it took a long time for me to see all the evidence for the weigh scale for me to tip. And so I'm finding more and more Muslims are looking. They say, I want to disprove you. And they start looking. And then they'll come back and say, boy, there's so much evidence that supports Petra in Jordan, and there's no evidence that supports Mecca in Saudi Arabia at this time. And so the weigh scale tips, and eventually people come and get very excited and say, now I've got a new perspective on the early years of Islam.
So I'm just going to try to understand something. Sorry, sometimes my brain just doesn't process well. Muhammad received his revelation in 630.
That's correct.
Sorry, 610.
Yeah.
In 600.
Wait, where was Muhammad?
That I'm not gonna go through that part. But
okay, yeah,
as
I believe he was in Petra.
So as he received his revelation, and then made according to Islamic tradition, hijrah to Medina, and then died in 632. Am I right to understand the mosques which you have looked, that there is not even one mosque turning a direct has the direction of the prayer to Mecca until end of the first century Hijrah.
That's correct.
So there are approximately 20 mosques are turning their face towards Petra.
That is
That
correct.
correct?
That is correct.
Because
That
I am pretty
includes the
amazed.
time. That includes the time of Muhammad, of
Yeah.
Abu Bakr, of Umar, of Uthman. I mean, all of these people, if these mosques are correct, all of these people prayed towards Petra in Jordan. The change did not come until later. And I've tried to, when I started looking at history, I don't see the change until the second fitna or the second civil war. That is when the change took place. And I would go back and say, well, okay, I can tell by the mosques about when the change took place. What do I find? And so I went back and started reading. And what do I find? A man named Ibn Zubair. What does he do? He knocks the Qibla down, the Qibla building down. He takes the black rock and he puts it in a stand. Okay, so here we have the Qibla building is gone and it's right in the middle of a war. And then we have a number of years, Al-Tabri is silent. They don't write what's in there. They don't tell us. They tell us very, very little. But what we end up with in the end is the Black Rock is down in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And then we have a very interesting inscription. And this is an inscription just outside of Mecca. It's about 60 kilometers out. So it's the people who are watching. It's in 78 after the Hijrah. And it says this is the year that Masjid al-Haram was constructed.
Yeah.
Now, can you believe that? 78 after the Hijrah, and they say this is the year that Masjid al-Haram was constructed. Now, I believe they're talking about Masjid al-Haram in Mecca, in Saudi Arabia. That inscription is there. There are photographs of it on the internet. People have studied it. You can go look at it. But for some reason, the people around Mecca say Masjid al-Haram was constructed here in 78 after the Hijrah.
So that makes
So that's our first clue.
697.
That's right. That's our first clue that the things that were switching towards Mecca and Saudi Arabia. And at the very same time, we're reading about the first Mecca, and Ibn Zubair is destroying it, what was there, and everything else.
Okay, so this is just for those who might miss the importance of something. At the time of Muhammad, at the time of Abu Bakr, at the time of Umar, at the time of Uthman, in the time of first caliphs, plus first century of Islam, there is none mosque, zero mosque, like zero is like none, okay? Zero mosque are facing their prayer direction to Mecca.
That is correct. I'm still looking. And if you find one, please send it to me. I'm still looking. We want to be able to check it and to measure it.
So maybe there is, like, but it will come up since Muslims were conquering lots of part of the world. Even the mosques in China weren't facing to Mecca. But I think it is amazing. Muhammad didn't have any problem praying direction of Petra. First caliphs didn't have any problem praying direction of Petra. 21st century Muslims wants to pray towards Mecca. Yet Allah changed the direction of the prayer from somewhere to Masjid al-Haram to please Muhammad. And today, archaeology tells us that direction was Petra.
That's correct.
And I expressed in a bit earlier that in the time of different part of the world today, there are Muslims decided to pray towards Petra because they want to join in with Allah and please Muhammad. That's the direction of the prayer Allah give to Muhammad.
That's right. Now, what's interesting is when we go to Petra, we can begin to find the places there that are listed. Now, there's no sign that says this is the place. So, for instance, in the center of Petra, there is a square building. There's the foundation of a square building, and it looks like a Kaaba, but it's bigger than the Kaaba in Mecca by just a little bit. So one of the things I did is I checked with Azraqi. Azraqi is an early writer, and his family were guardians and managers of the Masjid al-Haram, and he gives the measurements of the Kaaba building during the lifetime of Muhammad. When we take those measurements and compare that to the Kaaba building in Petra, the measurements fit exactly. There's the Kaaba square building. Now the Hatam, the wall, that curved wall, is not attached to the Kaaba. It's back a ways. And that's exactly what we would expect because it tells us one of the later caliphs attached it to the Kaaba building in Mecca. So we can go and find the Kaaba, the original Kaaba building. It's there. It has temples right around it. And so we've looked at that. And you can go and find the two mountains with the road in between them where they would go back and forth on pilgrimage. Those mountains have at the top of them places for idols, just as it's described in the early writings, which you can't find any of that in Mecca today. There is even a place where there is a huge flat platform with a column in the middle where people could throw stones at the column. It's there in Petra. You can go and find the camping places. You can go and find the Muzdalifah. This is the slippery slope going up the mountain, and there is a mountain there that goes up high where pilgrims would go up to the top of that mountain. And there at the top of the mountain is both a mosque and also an ancient church. And thousands of people could stand up there. It's like a plane. I mean, you're going up a very high mountain, but when you get up there, 5,000 or 6,000 people or more could stand all together easily up there because it's a huge area, and they could, be at the top of this mountain. Just exactly what is described in the ancient book. So we've taken the pilgrimage of that they did from the earliest times, even up till today, and we look to see, well, where did they start? And then from the water, there's a place of washing there where they started, and when they walk their way down to the Kaaba building, and then from there they go out to Mina and they go back, and eventually they go up to the mountaintop and back. It all fits, just as if you had picked up the pilgrimage and dropped it down on top. So we can find all the different stations of the pilgrimage. We can find places that correspond to this in the city of Petra. And let me tell you something interesting. Did you know that people made pilgrimages to Petra up until 1985? That's when the Jordanian government passed a fatwa against pilgrimage to Petra and put a stop to it, so no more pilgrims could go to Petra.
Sorry,
But up until then, there were
that?
still people going. 1985.
Okay.
Come to the website and look for the video on the pilgrimage.
Okay.
And you can check that out. So, I mean, the more we dig out, that's why this book here, Early Islamic Qiblas, it's out of date because we've learned so much more in the last 4 or 5 years. So, I mean, this is a good book, but we've added to it so many more things. But you will find in the back of this book, the Petra pilgrimages are listed here. Yep. Exactly. But now we've gone through and checked out and found exactly where some of these places are. So we keep learning more. We keep digging deeper, and we keep finding more evidence to support Petra than we do find evidence to support Mecca. And I could spend all night. We could spend all night talking here, but the best thing is to bring in some of these experts who can actually talk about these subjects as experts. For instance, in the Petra Scrolls, they're studying the language that was used there. It was written by Greek characters, but it was Arabic words written in Greek characters. By going back and looking at that, we discover that they used the earliest form of Arabic, very similar to the Quran. They use the definite article of al, where if you go down to Saudi Arabia, in the early days, the definite article was hin, hn. And so the Quran doesn't fit any of the language used around Mecca by any of the Bedouin tribes or any of the old inscriptions on the wall. But where does it fit? The language of the Quran fits the city of Petra, and that's just coming out in these last couple of years as different linguists are studying and are saying this is where we find the original origins of the Arabic language. We're finding it in the area around Petra. So again, another supporting evidence. So not any of these single ones prove it, but when I take all the Qiblas, and then I add all of these other things like the language and all the various things. There's over 50 of those listed in that book of
Yeah.
supporting evidence. By the end, you realize it's got to be true because I have got zero supporting evidence for Mecca except some guy writing 300 or 400 years after the events who may use the word Mecca. But then we have to decide, is this the early Mecca or the late Mecca?
Let me just bring up a question.
Sure.
How old is the Saudi Mecca in Saudi Arabia? Is there any archaeological proof for that? Are you aware of?
Back in the year 2002, when I was doing this study for the Jordanian government on the city of Mecca and on the city, sorry, of Petra,
Yeah.
and I attended a conference there. At that conference, there were a number of archaeologists from Saudi Arabia, and at this time, I was just asking questions. And so I asked a couple of these Saudi archaeologists who were there, I said, tell me, are there archaeological evidences at the city of Mecca? Because I read in these about the wall that was around Mecca. I read about the temples that were in Mecca. I read about, different things that were in Mecca, like what is in Mecca? And they looked at me and they said, you're going to quote us? I said, no, I just want to know. And they said, okay. They said, there's nothing in Mecca. Nothing at all. And what's very interesting, I've been watching very closely, is the building that has been going on in Mecca in Saudi Arabia, or those huge hotels that have been going up. And I've had opportunity to talk to some of the architects and some of the people who've been involved in the construction, asking questions. What are you finding when you dig those foundations? Are you finding any ruins? Are you finding any old buildings? And they said, other than that, there's a Turkish fort that was there, and that's not that old. But other than that, there is no archaeology when we dig at Mecca. It's not there.
I think
So
that's
I've heard it from the archaeologists. I've heard it from the people who are digging the buildings, the architects who have worked in Mecca, and none of them are finding any ancient history that goes way back. So it's supposed to have been a walled city with temples to all these different gods, and we're not finding any of those in Mecca and Saudi Arabia.
I think that's very sad because Islam claims to be a religion which is supported by history, yet there is no archaeological evidence from the headquarters of Islam for us to go and check it out. As
That's
we
right.
more look into it, we just see Islam goes against history as well as just destroys the history. Like there is nothing Islam can hold from the history for its accountability. Versus as we dig into the Christian archaeology, like British Museum is amazing. The archaeological things they have in the museum regarding the confirmation of the Bible, event, people, and places. Like Christian faith can stand on history versus Islam stands against history. I think as we look into more things will come up.
Yeah.
But I think
But
tonight,
but remember that missing evidence is not proof of anything. It's
yeah,
just we haven't found anything yet, but everybody's looking.
yeah. So like,
Okay, nowadays we're all alerted to this, so everybody's. But what we do find when we go to Mecca, in the region of Mecca, is an inscription saying that the Masjid al-Haram wasn't built until 78 years after the Hijrah. I mean, that's, like that doesn't fit the traditional, but it certainly does fit the idea of them moving the Black Rock down to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And people have asked, I've just done some videos on this, but I think they moved it to get it away from the Umayyads. They were fighting the Umayyads. I think they took the Black Rock away. A record of when they moved a bunch of people out of Ibn Zubair, moved a bunch of people away. That's the year that's empty. Nobody wants to talk about it in Islamic history. And so they moved it down to Mecca and Saudi Arabia. Just the rock, get the rock away. And so that rock was there for a couple of years, because that was about 70 after the Hijrah that the rock was moved. And so it's not till 8 years later that they build Masjid al-Haram. Because the rock was just taken there. And I think as the rock showed up, and the people down there are like, oh, look, there's this rock here. And so people would go over to touch it and to see it and to worship it. And eventually, they would be on display, and then people would go. And so they'd have to have restaurants, and then they'd have to have a hotel up there because people are coming to see it. And so eventually they developed this Masjid al-Haram around the rock down in Mecca. And eventually people began praying towards Mecca and Saudi Arabia. And there's lots of supporting evidence in early Islamic history talking about the traditionalists and the reformers. And we notice that the traditionalists give up or die out. And what's left are the reformers. And that's what we're seeing. The traditionalists who would have prayed towards Petra have died out. The reformers have taken over. And now, when the Abbasids come in, there's no question every Abbasid mosque points towards Mecca and Saudi Arabia. That's where they pray. There's no question. And from that time on, everybody, when they talk about Mecca, all the histories of both places just merge into one, and that's the place. So that's why you have Muslims today saying Abraham was in Mecca. And Christians are shaking their heads going, when did he take a journey that far, and how could it fit into what we know of Abraham? And it's way out of the way. And how do you get Hagar down in Mecca? And it just doesn't make sense. But the moment you move that story over to Petra, it begins to make a lot more sense. Now it's possible. Lot's tomb is only 60 kilometers away, where Sodom and Gomorrah is, and so forth. So we have Abraham in the area. We have, so Hagar was in that area. It's much more believable than Mecca in Saudi Arabia. And so that's why the stories got moved. And today we're faced with all of the stories together talking about Mecca and Saudi Arabia, and it becomes unbelievable.
yeah. So I meant to keep you only for an hour. I'm sorry, it's like been more than an hour.
It's okay.
So just for those of you who are watching, even though there are lots of new information which needs to go into this book, Early Islamic Qiblas, if you are working among Muslim people, if you are the group of people who wants Muslims to come to Lord Jesus Christ, I'll encourage you to get the book, learn it, look into it, and then ask basic question to the Muslims. And then also other book which we mentioned is the Quranic Geography. First read the Quranic Geography and then the Qibla book. They are very, very helpful. And then in the description of this video, you have links to the website which you can go and check it. So those are the
And you can buy the books electronically, because the printed books are quite expensive, but you can download the electronic books at a much cheaper rate.
yeah. And also subscribe to Dan Gibson's YouTube channel, which as he puts the new videos that you will be up to date. Those are historical materials. They get update very, very quickly, as in 5 years we might find 100 mosques facing to Mecca within first 20 years of Islam. So we don't know. But today, this is what we have. Today, this is what we have. And helpful to remember, up to today, we don't have any mosque facing towards Mecca as the direction of the prayer. Zero mosque from the first century of Islam. There is, according to archaeologists, there is no any artifact in Saudi Arabia, in Mecca, when you want to dig in to see what is there. I think those are kind of sad realities for today. But we don't know what will come up, what will be coming up next time. So we only talked about the mosques, kind of focused on Petra, but there are actually four different mosques, four different direction of the prayer. I am really hoping that we will have Dan Gibson back again to look at those and then see what else happening in the world of Islam, what is happening in first couple of centuries of Islam. Since history goes against Islamic tradition, and now we see archaeology goes against Islamic tradition. And it is very sad for Muslims, but those are good things for Christians, because it helps us to have conversation going on between Christians and Muslims.
There are many Muslims, though, who are open, wanting to know the truth. They want to know what actually did happen back then. So that's good. And I find that also among Christians. They want to know the truth. And so many want to know what happened in biblical archaeology, and what supports what and what doesn't. So I'm encouraged when people search for the truth and want to know. I want to know what happened, not just opinions. What can we actually learn about things? Because the truth is out there, and that's what we need to search for.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think we will finish the evening now, but I'm really hoping we will have follow-up session of tonight. And then if anyone wants to ask their question, please just drop me email. And then when we come to the next live stream, that we have the questions, and then we can start from the questions so that we don't miss or we don't run over each other. That will be helpful. For that, please send email to info@dcciministries.com. Please subscribe to Dan Gibson's YouTube channel, which called Dan Gibson, and then get the books, learn your history. Of course, as you look at the history of Islam, it will help you to question the archaeology of Bible as well as history of the Bible. So those are good materials for even us as a Christian.
Yeah, we go into the archaeology of Moses and of David, because these are all Islamic prophets as well. And so what has archaeology told us about these, and what can we learn? So there's lots of interesting stuff there.
Yeah. Oh, well, we will dig into that, and then we will look into that.
Okay.
Thank you very much all who joined us. Thank you very much who joined us through chat, and also huge thank you to our admin who has been helping. And we are very, very grateful that you made a time and joined us today. So thank you very much.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
God bless you.
Bye-bye.